Welcome and thank you for joining us today for Transcending Passwords, the next generation of authentication. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be moderating today's event. Our featured speaker is Chris Steffen, VP of Research covering Information Security, Risk and Compliance Management at EMA. Chris brings decades of industry experience to EMA, focusing on IT management leadership, cloud security, and regulatory compliance. He holds several technical certifications, including Certified Information Systems Security Professional and Certified Information Systems Auditor, and was awarded the Microsoft Most Valuable Professional Award 5 times for virtualization and cloud and data center management. And before I hand things over to Chris, I wanted the audience to know that we will be wrapping up today's presentation by taking your questions. Feel free to log them anytime by using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA with a link to the on-demand recording and more information about this new research report. So I hope you will check that email out. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our featured speaker, Chris Steffen. Chris, take it away.
Well, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are listening from, or if you're listening to this on a recording. Appreciate you taking some time today and listening to really some of the cool advances in passwordless authentication. Before we get started there, I'm going to go backwards a slide. And the reason I'm doing that is that just today, literally today is the, 16th of November, something like that. The Cloud Security Alliance announced a new certification called the CCCZ, ZT, sorry. You can see it here on the screen. I share that with you. It's another great certification if you're interested in zero trust. Obviously, if you're taking and doing identity stuff, you hopefully are interested in zero trust and how that is applicable to your job. But take a minute and look up that certification. Again, brand new today, a lot of information out there on it, and definitely something to make yourself aware of in the grand sphere of identity and so on and so forth. I wanted to get started, first of all, by thanking our sponsors, Hyper and Yubico. Been a huge fan of both these companies for a long time. They are outstanding to work with. If you are in the identity space, which again, I hope most of you are, better than average chance that you are working or have worked with these companies. If you haven't had a chance to do with them and you are interested in, FIDO, and we'll talk more about FIDO as we go on today, these are the leaders. These are the leaders and the contributors in that space. They can absolutely guide you in a proper direction. And really, if you're looking for identity in general, definitely worth taking and giving them a shout out. So take a look at them and tell them that Chris sent you, and trust me when I tell you, I don't think you'll be disappointed. I was chatting with Raleigh beforehand. I have a whole pile of Yubico tokens sitting here right in front of me. I collect these kind of things. I'm weird, but they are the class in the industry. So take a look at it. Take a look at Hyper, take a look at Yubico, and know that when you're doing identity, they are definitely some of the world's leading experts. So you're here today because we're going to talk about what passwords are, how to transition away from passwords. And this report will be available. You'll get a link at the end, and Raleigh will send you a link when it's all said and done. This is a précis. In fact, there's a Yubico token right there. When we write this report, you're the first to see this data. We haven't really had a chance to publicly announce it yet, and I'm happy to share it with you. Really kind of cool stuff to talk about. And I know that I want to save a little bit of time at the end for questions, but a lot of data, a lot of crunching. Send your questions, in the chat. I will answer them as I can. Hopefully we'll have some time when it's all said and done to answer a couple of questions, but just keep that in mind as we go through there. But the first thing we're going to talk about is the state of authentication. Great slide here. I wanted to talk specifically on average, business users employ 3 different types of authentication to access business applications, data, and IT services. Traditional passwords, as you can see here, continue to be the dominant form of authentication employed by business environments, with 91% of the surveyed business users noting they needed to perform job tasks using password authentication. Among these users, 49% utilize a password manager that records encrypted credentials so that login name information can be auto-filled. Again, we probably all use those at one point. Much more encouraging is that the indication that 69% of business workers now regularly use some kind of passwordless authentication. Very, very supportive of that idea. I think we can all agree that passwords are kind of antiquated. And the idea that we're using something passwordless is a really great stat there. Among organizations that support passwordless authentication, the technology employed is for 98% of access events. More secure FIDO-based authenticators, including mobile authenticator and security keys, were collectively noted as being about 18% of the users, supported by 70% of the businesses. So again, not quite all the way where we want to be with FIDO type authenticators. We'll talk more about FIDO adoption as we go on in the presentation. But again, I think some of the stats kind of speak for themselves. And I challenge you to read the report to kind of get more of this when it's all said and done. Security keys like the Yubico key that you saw before are physical devices, sometimes called dongles or key fobs, that enable access when they're connecting the proximity devices using for accessing IT services. Both FIDO-based mobile authenticator and security keys were twice as likely to be utilized by large businesses than small businesses, and were more popularly adopted by highly regulated industries like financial services and places where you had a lot of PII, a lot of highly secured IP, so on and so forth. So you're going to see that as we go throughout the report. Just wanted to pass that along. Frequency of authenticators. User experience with access processes have a direct impact on their productivity, job performance, and overall satisfaction. Again, no surprise there. Any friction associated with authentication processes is compounded by the frequency of the number of times the users must perform authentication tasks. On average, those surveyed business users reported authenticating 10 times each day across the business applications, data, and IT services required to perform their jobs. We've all been there. It stinks. I can't tell you how many times a day that I end up having to re-authenticate and use something else, so on and so forth. It has been the bane of most system administrators' existence for as long as I can count. According to the survey, most frequent authentication were performed by users communication, in communications, in sales, and in IT administration. Again, I speak firsthand from those particular places. Not surprisingly, a majority of those reported authentications involve entering a password, constituting 64% of the authentication tasks, as you can see in the figure there. Among the password authentications, 29% were auto-filled, frightening. These results make it clear that password authenticators far exceed the frequency of usage, and that traditional password-based authentications must be performed much more frequently than alternative authentication procedures. Again, the goal is that if you have some kind of passwordless device, that you're going to have to be taking and authenticating less. It's due to the fact that passwords continue to be utilized as primary authenticator in a majority of access processes, and the authentication reduction technology such as SSO and adaptive access are more frequently employed in conjunction with passwordless authentication solutions. Password resets. Who's had to reset their password? Yeah, everybody, right? With extremely high authentication frequencies and completion times, traditional passwords can easily be identified as the authenticator most impactful to the end user productivity. As a result, according to the surveyed users, a password is forgotten on average of 1.5 times by each user each week, forcing them to initiate a very time-consuming password reset and authentication procedure. The enforcement of password change policies actually decreases security effectiveness because they increase the likelihood that the user will violate password policies. Putting it on a sticky note, how many people in their conference rooms do they have a sticky note with some kind of password for a particular device under the keyboard? Again, don't need to show hands, but I know that it's happening, right? Nonetheless, 94% of business users indicated their organization periodically forces a password change. On average, a password reset was noted to be required 1.4 times each month for a business employee. So not even every 30 days. You're getting it about every 20 days when it's all said and done, for a variety of different reasons, right? Older users have been using passwords for decades and are more likely to accept that, as you can see in the chart here. They probably don't get quite as bent out of shape. The younger ones among us, they get a lot more bent out of shape by it because they're not as used to it. They are much more likely to embrace some of these other technologies. And we'll talk a little bit about retention a little bit further into this presentation. The sentiment towards passwordless authentication. Advances in technology coupled with revelations about the security inadequacies of traditional password approaches have refined many users' relationship with passwordless authentication solutions. Today, according to the survey, 59% of users recognize passwordless authentication as a more secure method, while only 13% consider passwords to provide better protection. Again, the data there kind of speaks for itself. Sentiments towards password authentication and security effectiveness have also correlated to a responder's age. As you can see in the graph here, with survey responders under the age of 50, twice as likely to indicate their preference of a passwordless authentication method instead of those that are older. 54% of the survey respondents reported they prefer passwordless authentication over traditional passwords. Only 13% said that they would prefer, traditional passwords. Again, I think that we're starting to see a move to passwordless. It's just going to take some time. You got a lot of, we'll call tribal and traditional things that have to kind of make their way through before some of these newer technologies are fully embraced. I wanted to spend a little time talking about security effectiveness. Again, not to get into this too much, but when you start taking and looking at some of the breach events, despite broad adoption of zero trust recommendations, and we can talk about zero trust again all day, those zero trust recommendations are always calling for two-factor authentication with some kind of policy control. It's still not quite as broadly adopted as you want it to be. 82% of those surveyed reported IT security breaches occurred in their organization in the last year. Most frequent things were virus infections, compromised passwords, phishing attacks. Some of these things aren't directly related to how their passwords are going to be. It's just another indicator that these breaches are occurring, and definitely something that we need to be paying attention to. When you start talking about I always share this kind of information too. When you start talking about the consequences, most frequently noted were the penalties imposed on employees who violated the security policies. And that could be anything from, sharing a password to writing their passwords down, whatever have you. About half were reprimanded but never terminated. Actually, about a quarter ended up being terminated, which is, again, quite fascinating when it's all said and done. So you're seeing these breaches actually end up happening. 1 out of every seven business breaches additionally reported difficulty obtaining cybersecurity insurance after the breach occurred, because the insurance companies, when they do their audit, they see that some of these problems are occurring, and they're looking for some of these controls to be remediated before they're willing to issue insurance to that company. Passwordless security perceptions. I wanted to talk a minute about this. Faced with escalating attacks and significant consequences to breach events, many organizations are looking to adopt passwordless authentication. Should not be a surprise to anybody. Over 81% of those IT managers surveyed said that they perceive passwordless technologies to be more secure, with 13% believing that they provide the same level of security. Great news. We're seeing some light there, seeing that these things actually do what we want it to do. More than half of the respondents believe that password authentication solutions will prevent nearly all of the most challenging cybersecurity threats, including key logging, virus attacks, ransomware, so on, man in the middle, whatever have you. Again, very interesting when it's all said and done to kind of look at perceptions. It gives you an idea of some of the uphill battles in the passwordless space that we're going to continue to have to fight. Again, I wanted to highlight those things. I wanted to also move on and talk a little bit about, how is the solutions being managed, and what is really the brain damage when it comes to, authentication management, and, how much time it takes to administer some of these kinds of solutions. The business costs related to authentication solutions are not limited to just end user productivity, but also apply to the brain damage, like I just mentioned, in IT administration. According to the research results, Administrators across all surveyed businesses collectively average about 3.5 hours of time every week managing user access, which is a ton of time. You figure that, these are your, tinfoil hat types that are already overworked, and 3.5 hours of their week is spent every week is spent taking and managing user access. Not really a surprise to this researcher, but when you start talking about where you can take and make improvements, this is one of those areas that should be something that everybody is looking into. Um, it, it basically, the way the survey worked out is that it equated to roughly 14 minutes of administration each week for every 100 employees in a company. The amount of administration actually does not scale evenly across organizational sizes. Smaller organizations, those with less than like 1,000 or so, actually spend 2 hours each week supporting every 100 user, while larger businesses, more than like 5,000 or so, spend as little more than 2 minutes for every 100 users. So there is some scale there, but again, this is disproportionately affecting the smaller businesses, and that's something that we need to be a little bit more aware of. I wanted to talk a little bit about authentication management too. When you start taking and talking about authentication management, it's not surprising that a majority of administrator time is spent managing authentication is attributable to supporting passwords. Again, no big surprise there. Organizations supporting passwords spend nearly half of access management administration time supporting processes like password resets, password policy enforcement, investigations, new policy creations, user setups, whatever have you, all part of trying to figure out how to make passwords work. The management of app-generated codes like Authy, Google Authenticator, SMS authentication, and smart cards were also noted to be significantly time-consuming to administer, accounting for, on average, roughly about 20% of access management administration time for each, according to our survey. So again, this is something when you start taking and looking at the FTEs involved in making authentication work, this is why passwordless is such an interesting and lucrative process for companies of every size. Obviously, big companies are already looking into it, but the small companies, as we just demonstrated, really have a vested interest in making this passwordless authentication really work for their organizations. I wanted to talk, and this is kind of how we'll close the conversation today. I wanted to talk a little bit about FIDO, and then we'll talk a little bit about employee retention and then open it up for some questions. But FIDO adoption is particularly interesting to me, right? So FIDO stands for Fast ID Online, FIDO, FDIO. In brief, FIDO standards provide a common language for passwordless authentication technologies to communicate with IT services. So as long as both authenticators and the service access conforms to FIDO standards, businesses no longer need to develop costly points of investigation and integration. Initial definitions released by the Open Industry Consortium, the FIDO Alliance, focused on enablement of passwordless technologies as a single authentication factor, or MFA verifier, and included the Universal Authentication Framework, UAF, and the Universal Second Factor standards. However, a giant leap forward was attained with the release of the FIDO2 standard, which incorporates user cryptographic authenticator with W3C web authentication, WebAuth, and enabled a built-in MFA without the need to rely on traditional passwords. I'm not going to read a whole lot more of that to you, but I do want everybody to understand that if you aren't using a technology today that is FIDO based and using the FIDO standard, that is a mistake. This is the up and coming open standards. You hear about OTEL, you hear about all these different kinds of open standards to make IT universe easier and more integrated. FIDO is that standard in the authentication world. And the great news is, again, both, I mentioned them both at the beginning, Hyper and Yubico are absolute leaders when it comes to FIDO. So again, look up the FIDO standard, understanding that this is the way that is going to be in the future. Utilize those solutions that are taking and deploying the FIDO standard, and understand that you'll be ahead of the game the more that your organization has the ability to adopt those standards and embrace that going forward. Some of the FIDO benefits, all the surveyed businesses that we surveyed have adopted the FIDO standard to at least some extent or another and have shown the business benefits of doing so. The most frequent reported benefit was improvement to security effectiveness. Again, no surprise. This was particularly true for smaller organizations, according to 65% of those that responded in the demographic. Large businesses most commonly cited the reduce of help desk tickets and password resets. Again, none of those things should be particularly surprising to anybody. Eliminating the need for the mundane task of frees up IT and security administrators to support more business-related tasks. And again, you're basically getting more of those FTEs back for free by taking and doing the right thing and adopting this kind of standard. Most notably, FIDO adopters noted 79% fewer successful phishing and smishing attacks, which are social engineering strikes executed over a phone call or text message. Again, just a weird corollary, but one of those things that, again, you want to be more secure, and this is a way to be more secure. We have about 5-10 minutes left. I want to take and talk a little bit about some of the outcomes and the futures in authentication just in general. So first of all, I want to talk about authenticators' satisfaction. Overall, the end users that we talked to reported general satisfaction with the authenticators they're currently using to access business resources, with 71% reporting they were somewhat or very satisfied. Again, no big surprise there. Business users employing FIDO-based mobile authenticators and security keys were more likely to indicate they were very satisfied with the solution, as you can see here in the figure. Users of OS-based authenticators such as Windows Hello and Touch ID were more likely to indicate that we're somewhat satisfied, really kind of indicating that, again, those FIDO-based solutions were the solutions that we really want to look at. By comparison, those business IT managers indicated much higher levels of satisfaction with their adopted authenticators. Businesses that adopted FIDO-based authenticators showed the highest level of satisfaction, with 100% of IT managers reporting that they were satisfied with the technology. Again, big numbers. Rarely when we conduct these surveys do we end up taking and having a survey result that's 100%. So I wanted to mention it specifically because it's very, very notable. FIDO-based security keys also garnered very high satisfaction rates, according to 3/4 of those surveyed business adopters. It is also noted that 56% of surveyed businesses have adopted FIDO standard reported they were very satisfied with their authentication processes, compared to only 23 of the non-FIDO adopters. Again, trying to indicate here, get on board with FIDO because it really makes the most sense for your organization long-term when it comes to their identity and passwordless authentication solutions. Lastly, I wanted to share this because, one of the questions that we always get is, how do we get talent? How do we retain talent? And I think that we can all agree that finding talent in general has been difficult. Retaining it is sometimes even more difficult. They get into a situation and they find out that we don't really like this organization. They have too many standards and policies that make it too difficult to work. And so we asked the question, is passwords and how you have to authenticate a big part of the problem? And amongst those surveyed business users, 65% would be motivated to change employers if presented with high friction authentication solutions. Again, no surprise there. If you're one of those people that has to authenticate 20 times a day, it gets old. I mean, it really is an impediment to getting your job done. More than half of the millennials surveyed under the age of 40 reported that they would be moderate to very motivated to seek new employment if they were frustrated with access solutions. Again, no surprise. In total, 78% of surveyed users reported they would be more attracted to a new employer if they offered easy-to-use access solutions. Again, age is a factor, no surprise. Millennials were significantly more likely to indicate that they would be strongly or very strongly attracted to employees that had low friction authentication solutions. So in conclusion, I know we only have a few minutes left, but in conclusion, I wanted to share 4 real things. None of this should really be news to anybody. And again, I challenge you to look at the report and gain some greater insights there. There's no way that I could take and cover the whole report in 30 minutes, but The greatest danger in relying on password today is that there's humans that are involved. We either forget them, we don't know how to use them, we have to constantly reset them. The policies are draconian and difficult to manage. It requires a lot of FTE. No matter how you look at it, passwords are an antiquated technology, and we need to be looking at other technologies, so on and so forth. Security threats are evolving constantly. They're constantly increasing. And the password security solutions that are, again, just password managers or whatever have you, they can't keep up. I mean, this is a antiquated solution. We've been using, passwords since, your grandparents' age, if not longer. And again, it's time to look at a more modern, more frictionless solution like a passwordless token, so on and so forth. Future proofing identity security begins with the broad adoption of FIDO. If you haven't heard me say that enough by now, I don't know what to tell you. FIDO is the way of the future when it comes to authentication and password authentication security. And FIDO-based password authenticators translate into greater employee retention. Again, I shared that last graph with you. That's really very much the truth. I mean, employees are looking for a reason to leave companies. There's a great market for technical people out there. The unemployment rate, despite, what you might believe about the economy, is still incredibly low. And so you want to do what you can to decrease the workloads and the brain damage that your average employee has to be able to work. And that's why taking and adopting FIDO standards probably makes the most sense. With that, I know I only have a couple minutes left. I did want to take and have a chance to answer a question or two. You can find the report by taking and going to this download. Again, Raleigh will send this deck or this report out to everybody who attended the webinars. And I know that Hyper and Yubico will also have availability to pass along this. But with that, I wanted to open it up to a couple questions and take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Yes, I invite you to visit both of the sponsor sites as well to learn more about this report and to learn more about their solutions. Chris, let's go ahead and jump into the questions. The first one is, people have been talking about moving away from passwords for years. Are we making any progress?
The answer, again, very quickly, the answer is yes. Part of the problem is that some of the password list solutions, the authenticator solutions, used to be just a ginormous pain in the rear. And I'll date myself here. I'm one of those guys that carried around an RSA credit card token, and you had to enter your 10-digit, 6-digit code, whatever it was, and you ended up seemingly having to do that, again, multiple times a day, only to find out that they were breached or have a problem, or you lost your token, or blah, 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 blah. I mean, problems over and over again. And the idea of having a passwordless token like a YubiKey, where you just basically tap it, it understands who you are, it sends the authentication signal, it's FIDO based. Yes, we're finally getting to a point where there are solutions out in the market that make this stuff actually work for businesses of every size. This is no longer a play for just the biggest of the big businesses. This is a solution where, again, Hyper or Yubico or any of those guys, regardless of the size of your business, they can come in and show you a deployment model for a business your size and make it work, 10 minutes later. That is something that didn't exist before. And that's why adopting these kind of standards is exciting for the first time really ever. And so that's why I encourage you to, at least, if you're not going to adopt it, you should at least be aware of it and look into what it actually means to be able to adopt these standards.
Great. Thank you, Chris, for taking that question. And I wanted to thank our audience for joining us today. As I mentioned, you will be receiving a follow-up email from EMA with resources from today's event. So be sure to check that out and check out the sponsor sites as well. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
If you have any other questions, you can always check with me on LinkedIn. If I don't have the answer to your question, I will find the answer to your question either through our sponsors or through our vast network. But again, join us on LinkedIn, join us here at EMA. I'm always happy to answer those questions. I'm sorry I didn't have more of a chance to answer more today.
That's great, Chris. I will let the people who asked the questions, I'll send those on.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.